Hi everyone, this is Dr. Antonelli, and today's part one of today's lecture is the beginning parts of the instructional strategies, approaches to instruction, chapter 13 in your text, topic 8 for us as a whole, where I've combined some of the things from prior topics into this that are relatable. So let's take each thing and talk about the big ideas. When we talk about instructional strategies, we're talking about how effective teachers really get in there and identify knowledge and things that they want students to know and be able to do, and then they plan accordingly based on that information. And then we talk about some of the kinds of instruction, more specifically the two types: teacher directed and learner directed. Some cases teacher directed is more effective, and other times it's learner directed. And then we will also talk about some different instructional strategies that are actually appropriate, and the difference between goals and objectives, and how different students, react differently to the way the lessons are structured. Okay, so the case study that this topic has to do with is one called the Oregon Trail. You can read it in these two slides here. And this case study has to do with a fifth grade teacher's class learning about the westward migration of American settlers during the middle 1800s and how they travel the Oregon Trail in covered wagons. And so the teacher does a lot with this lesson instead of just trying to explain and lecture on what it was like for the settlers. This particular teacher makes it very kind of firsthand for students to try to experience that. So some of the strategies that the teacher uses to kind of engage her students is she creates like a wagon on the floor with masking tape so that they can actually see how big this wagon was that people traveled on. She also kind of creates this disequilibrium, also known as cognitive dissonance, within students because she gives a list that doesn't actually match what the class kind of talked about in reference to things that could be brought in the wagon. She poses a challenging question, which is another great way to engage and motivate students. Challenge them to take only one item out of a whole slew of items that they might want to take onto the wagon, but they can't. There's not enough space. And then it's a very social and interactive one because all the students get a chance to see if they could fit within that masking tape area of the wagon. And then there's a piece of fantasy where, you ask students to imagine doing something or being somewhere else, okay, making that a very good lesson for engagement and motivation. Some other strategies that she uses to help them learn and remember the content of the lesson: she uses visual imagery, seeing that picture of the wagon on the floor. She elaborates on certain things, such as, what things they might want to take on their list, what would be necessary, what might not work, what might be a hazard, and then to kind of think about hypothetical situations that they might face and then relate it to what the settlers were facing by having to pack only certain items in their wagons. So again, lots of good things going on in this lesson. That's why it's a great case study to look at to start this idea of instructional strategies that are effective. There's two general approaches, as mentioned in the big ideas slide, and that was teacher-directed instruction, is also known as expository instruction. This is where the teacher is mainly the director of the lesson. They're largely in control of what is being taught and how it's being taught. So the teacher may do a bit of showing something, let's say, up in front on a whiteboard or a smartboard or a chalkboard if they still have those. And they may ask some questions to kind of guide the discussion, but the teacher is really the center of this kind of instruction, okay? In learner-directed instruction, the students have a great deal of say in what they're going to learn and how they're going to learn it. Sometimes there's lots of choices in learner-directed instruction. That's not to say that the teacher just kind of sets the students, free to do whatever they want. Absolutely not. What it really means is that the teacher has kind of structured how the class will run, but the majority of what goes on takes place in the hands of the learners, okay? It could be even from their interests down to choices of how they want to come to, let's say, answers or problem solve or do things that the teacher has set up for them, okay? These are theoretical kinds of perspectives that really relate to the approaches to instruction. The behavioral perspective and the cognitive perspective kind of work very closely with the teacher-directed instruction model. And we're going to get further detail on that later on in the PowerPoint. And this works best for teaching things like basic skills that require a step-by-step, very structured instruction method, where the teacher, for example, has to show how to do a math problem, let's say long division. A basic skill, again, requiring step-by-step, works best under behavioral and cognitive perspective and teacher-directed instruction. The humanistic and social perspectives or theoretical perspectives basically are closer to the learner-directed instruction because we look at the needs of humans and students, and we look at their social nature to kind of want to work together. And in learner-directed instruction, as we said in the prior slide, is that a lot of the upfront work, things that the students are doing, are working together in groups, often cooperative groups, and there's a lot of open-ended discussion of ideas and concepts that either came from the interests of students and the teacher just kind of structured them in a way that set them off to work in this kind of group setting or setting where they discover things on their own. Okay, so that's kind of how the perspectives, the theoretical perspectives, fall in line with either teacher-directed or learner-directed. Okay, a couple things to remember. There are a number of different what we call interdependent relationships, and interdependent relationships really have to do with one thing kind of depends on another, which depends on another, which depends on another. And there's usually more than two things in this scenario. So when we look at the characteristics of students and their behaviors, this is something that impacts how teachers plan for instruction, how they actually instruct, how they assess what students are doing, and how they set up the classroom environment, okay? And then everything that teachers do, the planning, instruction, assessment, and the environment, is influenced by the student characteristics and behaviors, and kind of vice versa. So they really, if we had to put arrows between these things, all of these things are interrelated and interdependent on each other, okay? There really are no outliers here. Okay, the next few slides really get into a number of key elements of planning for teachers. This is all the things that go on prior to a lesson being taught. Okay, so when a teacher decides what they're going to teach, they're going to identify what is that end result that I want to come out of this lesson, okay, or this week of this math class, or by the end of the school year for my students who are in third grade, let's just say. So again, the teacher has to think of that first and foremost, okay? They may start their planning by actually working backwards. The idea of backward design is where the teacher looks at how and what assessments they're going to use, and then they work backwards from there by then planning instruction based on those assessments. Okay, so for example, if I know that I want to assess students in a timed way with how many addition facts that they can correctly answer in, let's say, 2 minutes, then I would plan lessons where some of my activities would be for students to actually practice within a time frame. Because if I'm going to assess that way, then I might want to give them some practice during a guided practice part of my lesson, let's just say, in a timed fashion, so that they kind of get used to that. So that's a good example of backward design, okay? Another element, key element of planning is these end results that teachers look for in the beginning before they even get into the actual implementation of the lesson, is to decide, here's what I want to teach, how do I want to teach it, and then how am I going to assess, okay? All of those things, the what, the how, and the assess, is really going to influence how I plan and what steps I'm going to put into my lesson, okay? The first thing we do in planning, besides all that background thing to think about, is to then actually start writing some goals and objectives. The big difference between goals and objectives is that goals, instructional goals, are very general kind of statements or long-term outcomes. For example, write a coherent and grammatically correct short story by the end of the year. This is a pretty broad kind of goal, and it's going to take a lot of steps and a lot more specific kinds of skills in order to get to that goal in the long term. So that's where objectives come in, which are more specific short-term kinds of outcomes. And these specific short-term objectives are often kind of the steps or building blocks or way to get to the general long-term outcomes that you've identified as a goal. Okay, so for example, if we stick with the writing the coherent and grammatically correct short story as our goal, some specific objectives for that would be learning how to spell 10 words, using subject verb sentence construction, using transition words between paragraphs. These are going to require daily lessons, and then some observable kind of verbs when we write an objective. We're going to talk about that in a second, to actually capture to see if students are able to do that. Okay, so this idea of these observable verbs and behaviors, these are words that sometimes teachers use in their objectives. Like a student will be able to identify 5 nouns in the following sentences, or a student will be able to write a sentence with a subject and a verb in it. These are the kinds of structures you'll see when we're writing objectives, but the behaviors that they're writing about have to be observable. What that means is it's something that we can measure and see a student doing. So for example, knowing, can you observe something a student knows? No, you cannot. Another one that's not observable is remember, because again, if a student's remembering something, they're actually doing something more specific. They're probably telling you the name of something. They're probably identifying a date. They're probably doing more specific things that are observable than the word remember as a verb to use in an objective. So the word remember is not observable. The word appreciate is not observable. Okay, the word understand is not observable, and the word recognize is not observable. All the others, which is identify, choose, explain, recite, write, and do, all of those are observable, and they're good to use in an objective. We can see and actually measure when students do those things. They identify something, choose something, explain something, recite something, write something, or do something. And that makes it really clear to a teacher that a student has met that particular objective. Okay, so something big to keep in mind with writing objectives. Okay, in the next part of this lecture voiceover, we're going to get into some of what we call categories of objectives. So we'll start there for the next part 2 of this PowerPoint, and then we'll pick it up from there. Okay, I will see everyone in part 2.